Shalom, and welcome again to another exciting topic of interest edition of the Torah Watchman Show International LLC. That's my company, 501c3 organization, hosted by myself. Hope everyone's been well. The title of this video is The Dichotomy of Torah Truths. I'm going to break it out by the different denominational constructs that comprise Judaism of today. Now, if you are an observant Jew, you probably are familiar. If you're Reformed or a Chabadnik or maybe a Nanak, Sedum, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, Qara'ite, conservative, you know what you believe, because this is probably how you were raised. And if you went to a cheder when you went to grade school or went to yeshiva, as an upperclassman do, if you had that benefit of Jewish education, well, the historical underpinnings come along with all that academia of belief and study. But you know, we say Am Yisrael Chai at the end of the day, but we are very diversified. Among the diaspora, depending on where you live, your cultural, traditional pedigree of beliefs handed down to your great-great-grandparents and so on really separate you from other countries. Like if you're in Lithuania versus Melbourne, Australia, versus in the America, versus England and Spain, or Greece, or Italy, or wherever, Russia Federation. You have special lore, and fairy tales, and legends, and things like that, that other people may not have the benefit of because they weren't raised that way. But when it comes down to the Torah, that's the single arbitration of truth, the only arbitration of truth, the black and white there, not the 50 shades of gray. And that's when we get into denominational explanations in a moment, you'll see how the range of different beliefs, how they stretch out from the core beliefs that Moshe espoused to the 5 books of the Torah as the only servant before God who saw God face to face in a waking state, not asleep, no night visions like the prophet Daniel and others, but God called him to the mountain. God called him to the tent of meeting, and God spoke to him like I'm speaking to you. And no other prophet of God, no other Navi, ever in the entire Tanakh do we know about that saw God in his essence, in his truth, to say that when God spoke, Moshe listened and he wrote it down. And that's what I'm talking about. But who wrote the Torah? And that's how we're going to be answering this among all the different branches, the major branches of Judaism. Beginning with Reformed Judaism. To break this out further, under human authorship, which I care about more than anything else, and is the focal point of this video. The Torah is seen as a collection of writings by various people over time. That's very generalistic, you know. It reflects the primitive ideas, language, and historical context of the eras in which it was written over a period of, say, 3,500 years, or you go back maybe 4,000 years when Abraham and Sarai left Haran in Mesopotamia and was called by God to come into the land of Canaan, which started the story of young Israel. Divine inspiration, very important point here. While not literally offered by God, according to Reformed rabbis, the text is considered divinely inspired. Okay, how do you define divinely inspired may be different than Reformed Jews. A record of our ancestors' encounter with the divine and their ongoing struggle to understand God's will. Okay, a few things here, dichotomy of truths, that there is the fundamental belief that Reformed Jews share with all other Jews, that they do believe in a divine, eternal Father, but sometimes in the more liberal part of Reform Judaism, they see a more feminine part of God versus masculine, and they actually have gone as far as to have a gender-neutral Bible as not to offend anyone, okay? But they do talk about God's will, and they look at the Bible as essentially as a historical book, per se, written by many different authors, in addition to Moshe, okay? And we're talking about the Torah, the 5 books. We're not talking about the Navi or the sacred writings or the larger part of the Tanakh for the Hebrew Bible. Now, evolving revelation, okay? Reform Judaism emphasizes progressive revelation. You've heard this term in my videos and others, like Rabbi Tovia Singer, progressive revelation. You hear this in Christianity, how when they have problems, and their apologetics, when they get confused in these debates and speeches and everything they make, when Jews challenge them or other Christians challenge, say, a Southern Baptist pastor, they say, well, it's our belief by Billy Graham, per se, so Billy Graham believed this, so I believe this because I follow Billy Graham. Or I follow Martin Luther, I'm a Lutheran, or whatever. And progressively, as time evolves, we have a different view than what was written by Apostle Paul. So when Christians say this, you see immediate similarities here and commonality between Reform Judaism and evangelical Christianity, which I think is interesting. So God's truth is not fixed in a single moment, but continues to be revealed in every age through human reason and experience. So, in other words, what is truth? Okay? Is truth based on your academic knowledge, per se, or your intellectual quotient, or how many degrees you have, if you have a PhD in biblical languages, per se, or linguistics, or archaeology, or whatever. So if you are an authoritarian in certain fields like this, say like the Bible, or the history of the Jewish people, or the archaeological evidence of people go and explore the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on, and things like that, they have an authoritative feel as a public figure. So when they say announcement that I discovered XYZ, and I believe this to be true, then maybe a rabbi may adopt that opinion and move forward in how they shepherd their flock for their Reform synagogue. So human reasoning can be a form of evolved truth for the modern era versus what Moshe reasoned to be true and what he sacrificed his life and was literally stoned for, and had insurrection of the Qara'ite rebellion and so on, because his truth was challenged even back then. The same arguments we have about the Torah today was the same arguments that Moshe dealt with, like the followers of Qara'ite and other people that argued with Moshe, and you can read that in the books of the Torah. Historically, okay, history, may history be our guide. The movement often accepts, the Reform movement, often accepts modern scientific and archaeological research, okay, as their justification for continuing the linear path of evolved reasoning. Many Reform Jews do not view the Torah's miraculous narratives or early historical accounts, such as the creation story or the scale of the Exodus in itself, as literal historical facts. In other words, they look at it as metaphors or similes or something, or a symbol of something, but is not to be taken literally, okay? Now, this is Reform Judaism. Now, under authority and application, now I'm spending more time on Reform Judaism because it's more complex. Non-binding commandments, okay? Non-binding. Because it is viewed as a human-influenced document, the legal codes, or halakha, in the Torah, are not considered eternally binding, okay? Because if the Ten Commandments is not legally binding and is subject to interpretation and human reasoning, then it can be compromised or modified or added and subtracted to. You see where I'm going? Okay? Reformed Jews typically believe that they have the autonomy, the right, as individuals to choose which tradition and commandments remain meaningful in the modern world. Okay? So they can take bits and pieces of, say, Orthodox oral law or tradition. They can take some of that and then add it to their culture, per se. Say, if you're a Reformed Jew raised up in Germany, incidentally, some Reformed rabbis teach that their Zion is not in the mountains of Moriah in Jerusalem, but actually in Berlin, because that's where it was founded. Okay, it's very interesting. The moral over the ritual law, okay? Moral relevancy. While ritual and dietary laws are often seen as optional or culture. You like shrimp? I've been in a Reform synagogue, and someone told me, well, their kitchen there is no longer kosher because someone or some previous rabbi allowed them to bring in shrimp or crustaceans at one time, and it lost its kosher root status. And who established kosher root in Judaism? Well, love it or hate it, it's the Orthodox. Or you would actually ask an Orthodox rabbi with a degree in dietary health science, and they would come in and they would certify that kitchen to support parve, dairy, and meat separation. So I actually had the experience of a historical Reformed synagogue in Charleston, South Carolina once, and they talked about this, okay? So continuing on, the Torah's moral and ethical teaching, such as the pursuit of justice, or like tikkun olam. Tikkun olam, you hear about a lot about that. If you talk about it and observant circles in Israel, then they laugh at you. It's not even really Hebrew. Generally it's talking about refuah shalema for the world. And that is a divine commandment that God gave to Adam and Havilah in the very beginning, and ethical treatment of animals. And Moshe expounds this in the 613 mitzvot about how not to tease or torment an ox. Okay? All these examples. But tikkun olam, you hear this more than anything else in Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism than any other branch. It's actually used as an excuse for not keeping kosher root according to Jewish traditional halakha. So it's a dichotomy of what's foundational and authoritative. If Moshe is not the divinely inspired authoritarian over the Torah or the 613 mitzvot, they could be widely subject to any form of human understanding today and interpretation, which leads to compromise. And it's a very slippery slope. Now, a good segue is conservative Judaism. American conservative Judaism was founded here in the United States, okay? I currently go to a conservative synagogue, a shul, only because I believe in walking on Shabbat, and my wife currently has severe walking limitation, how far she can walk, and this is the closest shul that we can walk of our family. And I have an impressionable 9-year-old daughter, and we cannot walk to an Orthodox shul or a Chabad house per se because it's too far, even though we do live in an eruv, which is a Orthodox word for a Jewish community that has boundaries in which you allow certain rights and privileges during Shabbat, like walking and carrying certain things, okay? So back to conservative Judaism. Generally views the Torah as a divine human encounter. Well, more or less, that's true, okay? Because Moshe was a human, last time I checked, okay? And the prophets were too. Rather than a text literally dictated by God. Now, the only thing that I would agree with is that the Ten Commandments, the 2 stone tablets, both times, Moshe went to the Mount Horeb along the chain of Mount Sinai, mountain chain. the highest peak there of Mount Sinai, known as Mount Horeb, in that area. And some people argue about where Mount Horeb was and is and everything. It's not that important. But say Mount Sinai, those 2 stone tablets originally were cut out of the face of the mountain, and by God's own hand, according to the Torah, and that passage in Shemos, that God with his own hand, he wrote the 10 Commandments there. Moshe didn't write that into that stone. How could he write in the stone? Like they had a chisel or something, whatever. But the second time when Moshe was called to the mountain, because he destroyed the first pair of tablets on the golden calf, when he went back up the second time, he was instructed to simply cut out the tablets and then take those blank tablets up back to the mountain, and then God would rewrite the 10 Commandments on that. So with that being said, God did write the foundational 10 Commandments as far as the 613 mitzvot, or the middle and lower requirements that are breakout for that major 10 Commandments. Okay? Now, while holding that the Torah is sacred and divinely inspired, the conservative movement, acknowledges its historical development and role of human interpretation. So they don't have, they don't have that much room or 50 Shades of Grey per se as Reform Judaism, but they do have a freedom, autonomy per se, for interpretation of what those laws mean, okay, for us in the 21st century, okay? And that's all fair, and I understand that kind of thing. And even I, for my family, I try to understand what the 613 mitzvot meant, the commander intent of that, when God gave that to Moshe, when the Mishkan was operational in the desert with Moshe and the 12 tribes of Israel, how those laws meant then, and why they were purposeful and needful at that time, and why they're important for us to abide by as much as we can living in the diaspora, like in the United States, okay? Now, key beliefs regarding the authenticity under conservative Judaism include the following. Non-literal revelation, okay? Most conservative theologians reject the dictation model, quote unquote. Some of these words I have not heard of until very recently, and I talked to a rabbi and I got an argument about this subject. That every word was dictated to Moshe and no one else. That is an authoritative dictatorial belief shared by a majority of the observant Jews, and I'm talking about Orthodox Judaism, we'll get that in a moment, but they don't believe that Moshe wrote the entire 5 books of the Torah, okay? They actually believe through an hypothesis and theorem, like geometry, and you can research this yourself, and they teach this in conservative yeshivas. I just found this out, and I was very disappointed, because my wife was a conservative Jew when I married her, and she told me all about it and everything else. But anyway, it's very important to understand why they believe what they believe. It's based on the modern empirical method, the data findings from archaeological studies, literally digs in the Holy Land and things of that nature, dating techniques and all of this. So they look at the science, they look at the technology, the innovation and all this, and they compare apples and oranges with what they read to be true in Hebrew and the 5 books of the Torah. So, historical development. The conservative movement accepts modern biblical scholarship, including the idea that the Torah was compiled from multiple sources over time. Like a rabbi told me, a conservative rabbi told me one time, under the Reform movement, under the righteous king of Hosea, that they were writing some of the books of the Torah that we believe that only Moshe wrote. And that's one theory and belief and hypothesis that is yet proven to be true, but that's what they teach. Binding authority halakha. Despite acknowledging human authorship, conservative Jews believe the Torah remains legally binding, okay? So you're talking about the different schisms in Orthodoxy and oral the oral Torah belief and tradition, as far as the Gemara, versus all the different rabbis who have debated over time through their different Talmud tractates, the legally binding aspect of truth, that if you get into a really big argument and you cannot find a consensus, you go back to the original Sidrach, you go back to the original Torah portion there, and that becomes your truth until someone else has a better way of explaining their hypothesis, okay? So its authority is seen as stemming from the ongoing covenant between God and Jewish community, and that could be a Jewish community in Maryland, could be a Jewish community in Berlin, Germany, it could be a Jewish community in Melbourne, Australia, it could be a Jewish community in Indonesia, Japan, Spain, Europe, Russia, wherever. So that understanding between you and God is very important. So if a rabbi, say in Maryland, over a conservative synagogue, could have a different opinion on what marriage is between a man and a wife, just a man and a woman and no other blended sexes, he may have a different belief of that in Maryland versus, say, the state of Florida, okay? Now, progressive revelation, again, you hear this word here, and Christians are proud about that. It's something they brag on. Why? This is how they explain away the Trinity and the Godhead, the triune Godhead, and all this stuff they explain away from Apostle Paul's writings and everything else. You hear the word progressive revelation. Well, here again, like Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, revelation is often viewed as a continuous process where each generation interprets ancient truths in a modern context. In other words, why do we choose to continue living in the United States when Israel declared independence, in 1948? Well, we may not like the way the government is there, like it seems to be filled with violence, and you don't want your son or daughter to be drafted in IDF if they're of age and moving there, but you make a choice to live in America versus moving your family to Israel, okay? So you may fall back on progressive revelation for that, to be able to justify that sanity check in your belief that you try to explain why to your wife of preferences, why you're continuing to work, and you're also planning your will and everything to be buried, in a local Jewish cemetery, say, in Maryland. And versus going to the Mount of Olives. This is what I'm talking about. So we're talking about pluralism of thought. Beliefs within this movement range from viewing the Torah as a direct message from God to seeing it as a human response to divine presence. Listen, to be human is to err, right? And God expects us to have errors. That's why we are commanded to give charity for those sins or those misdeeds, for breaking the holy mitzvot and things of this nature. We understand that. But to read the laws of God and know the morality of there, and if that's an absolute truth in your mind, and other rabbis, say conservative synagogue somewhere, say in Oregon per se, or San Francisco, then it's for you to choose that. They may be more progressive in their revelation than the revelation on Mount Sinai. And that's pretty much what I'm saying. Now, the next section is Qara'ite Judaism. Holds that the written Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, is the sole, authentic, and infallible source of divine law given by God only to his humble servant Moshe on Mount Sinai. So when Moshe went to Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, he received all the halakha, all the laws of God, all the stories, historical stories to be told, like in Bereshit, and even the writing down of things he couldn't possibly known, the story of him being a baby in Goshen, Egypt, and being raised, by Pharaoh's daughter and this kind of thing. All these things leading up to his own life that he could testify himself because he lived it. Well, all these things were given to Moshe in that period of 40 days and 40 nights. But even before he went to the mountain, remember, even the schematics and the planning for building the Mishkan, building the Ark of the Covenant, all of this was being introduced. In fact, God admonished Moshe for not resting on Shabbat in the very beginning when they're coming before that great mountain, Mount Sinai. Okay, where we believe that the giving of the Torah was a national event to the Jewish people. Now, Qara'ite core beliefs regarding the Torah's authenticity include the supreme and exclusive authority. We do not question it. The rejection of oral law. Why? Because oral law was invented, and created by human beings that were not called to be prophets or Navi of God. Okay? This is their belief. Qaraites reject oral law, which is codified, written down in the Mishnah Torah, and you have different ones of those. You have ones written by the Ramban, Rashi, and a few others, and you have the Shulchan Aruch and other things, the Jewish code for all Jewish laws, halakha, that governs everything you should and should not do during the seventh day or Shabbat, as man-made and not divinely inspired. Logically, whether you're a Qara'ite Jew, Reform, or Conservative Orthodox, or whatever, you have to agree with this, what it's saying. Even in life, you have things called objective evidence and subjective evidence. You know the difference between them. If you're a scientist, when you make opinion, it's scientifically based on something. You have an hypothesis, you have many different hypotheses, and eventually one of those hypotheses evolves and leads to a theorem or a theory based on the quandary of available scientific evidence that you can quantify in a laboratory environment, in nature or space or the earth and geology, that kind of thing. You see, that's objective because you have peer review and you have other debating scientists that are doing the same kind of field of study, and people pay big dollars in these clinical organizations and laboratories and something like that. Is objective reasoning based on academic knowledge and very little room of opinion that could be biased, okay? Subjective means essentially, like all of Reformed Judaism, and don't get angry at me, is subjective. It is human rationale and human reasoning versus the dictatorial executive authority that Orthodox and Qara'ite Jews give only to Moshe and no one else. So we have objective reasoning, the 5 books of the Torah, literally written by Moshe, inspired by God to Moshe and no one else, okay, versus subjective reasoning, where Moshe wrote a lot of it, but he didn't write all of it, and other people wrote it. We don't know who they were, but by tradition, we say it's divine, so we stand up when the Torah comes out of the ark in the synagogue. That's what we do by tradition. Sufficiency of Scripture. They believe the Torah is self-explanatory. They, as Qara'ite Jews, self-explanatory, and that God made his laws clear enough for every individual to understand without rabbinical mediation. Folks, this is true. It is Emet true. Why? Because Moshe said, what did he say? The Torah is not difficult to understand. It's not too far. It's not too high. It's not too low. It's not in the deepest ocean. It's not beyond you. It is clear to understand. If Moshe said it's clear to understand, and he says you are never to add or subtract to it, it means it is good. It is perfect. Like God said when he created the heaven and the earth, it is very good. And I don't need to do anything else. On the seventh day, the Lord rested because he didn't need to add or subtract anything else from that perfect creation. That's why Qara'ite Jews believe in that, okay? But yet there's an individual responsibility, which is a commonality between the other sects of Judaism. Every Jew has a personal religious duty to study the Torah diligently, directly, and decide its correct meaning for them. If you have a family, you have children, sons and daughters, and you read the Torah at home, where you adopt what the Torah says the way you understand it to be for your own halakha in that home. Now, that doesn't mean that you go into subjective reasoning where you bring home lobster, Cape Cod, from Massachusetts lobster, or bring a crawfish from Louisiana or a catfish or something because you like it and everything else. I think that the Torah said it, and when it says you're not allowed to eat these things, that's not what it's talking about. They're simply saying you don't need to call a rabbi permission to miss a service of Sabbath in a synagogue when you have a fever, or you're sick, or you're having problems in your heart. You don't have to ask permission to take heart medication and all these other things that you do in Orthodoxy. That God has given you common sense. God has given you the brilliance the genius of intellect and understanding, because you're created with that divine spark, your soul. So that acknowledgement there is true, that you understand the Torah when you read it in Hebrew, when you apply it to your own lifestyle, okay? Whether the different color of your kippah, or if you grow a beard or not, that kind of thing, or how closely you shave it, if you have sideburns, whatever you do in your appearance and your witness, all that, no one has the right to judge that this is not kosher and this is not halakha correct, basically, okay? Now, metaphor versus liberalism. We all talked about metaphors and liberalism in discussing Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism. What Qara'ite Jews are pointing out, they're giving examples. While often called literalists, okay, I'm called a literist, Qara'ites actually view several commandments as metamorphical. For example, they interpret the command to bind the words as a sign upon your hand, as a metaphor for remembering the law rather than a literal command to wear tefillin. This is a difference between Qara'ite Jews and most other Jews, even Reform Judaism that wear tefillin, okay? So that's how they differ, and a metaphor versus something literal, like tzitzit, for instance. Historical preservation, Masoretic tradition. Folks, Qara'ite Judaism and no other Judaism are responsible for Masoretic text as we understand it today. Every art scroll Tanakh you have, every Chumash has those little pointers and the symbols and signs and things. That, folks, that is for vowels, okay? Before Masoretic text, which is like oral tradition for linguistics, is something we estimate and guess how a certain word like Adonai and everything is pronounced. Did Moshe pronounce Adonai the same way that we pronounce it today? Well, to make that accurate as much as possible, we want to speak good grammar in Hebrew, right? Okay, that's what a school teacher tries to teach us, is that you need that Masoretic text to know how to pronounce a word. You can have two Hebrew words that look almost identical, but without understanding Masoretic text, they can have two different meanings completely, and you'd be totally confused. So yes, Qara'ite Jews were the ones responsible for making the initial discoveries in the Qumran caves of Masoretic text, okay? Even though many other Jews have taken credit for that, okay? So they were deeply involved in that study, okay? In the accurate preservation of the Hebrew text, and that was their goal. The famous Masoreite Aaron ben Moshe ben Asher, who helped standardize the Tiberian vocalization, how to pronounce Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, is even used today, and reading from the Torah scroll in a shul. Okay, it is widely believed to have been a Qara'ite innovation. Authentic Judaism. Qara'ite believe the movement represents the original form of Judaism as practiced before the man-made traditions of the Pharisees and later rabbis gained dominance. Okay, I had someone who correct me, an Orthodox who correct me, that oral Torah and written Torah were both given on Mount Sinai to Moses at the same time. I said, excuse me, I've seen the movie with Charlton Heston and Ten Commandments. He only came down the mountain with 2 stone tablets. Where are all the tractates, the Talmud today? You know, and if that was true, then why did the rabbis require, 1,000 years or more, before they wrote down this oral Torah that was supposedly given to Moshe on Mount Sinai? So for me, it's confusing. Now, tradition known among Qara'ite Jews, there's a word here, Savil Ha-Rusha. While they reject oral Torah as divine law, divinely inspired, Qara'ites recognize Savil Ha-Rusha, the yoke of inheritance, okay? These are the ancestral tradition passed down through through our generation, the Qara'ite Jews, but unlike rabbinical law, they are only kept if they do not contradict the plain meaning of written Torah. Yes, Qara'ite Jews have traditions. We have different hakams. We going to use the word rabbi, Torah scribes or hakams, that kind of thing. And they have tradition like, can you light Shabbos candles, that kind of thing. And what is the rule of modification when you light a flame? Do you have to put that flame out before Shabbat begins? That kind of thing. So there's many traditions there, but they don't write it down as a traditional halakha in a book for governance and authority. Okay? Because there's only one authoritarian that we follow, and it's Moshe. And even the thousands of prophets that followed Moshe after he died, a blessed memory, they were espousing the original laws and commandments that Moshe had taught the Jews of his generation, okay? Everyone knows the most predominant form of Judaism today, Orthodox Judaism. I don't have to spend a lot of time with this because it's just everywhere. I mean, you go to Chabad, you have the Chabad app, they have all the tools, they have all the information. At Judaica bookstore has more books there about Orthodox than any other form of Judaism. They believe a lot of the things that Qara'ite Jews, okay, they believe the Torah originated in heaven. Some of them believe that the Torah existed before the creation of heavens and the earth, before the book of Bereshit was even written. It asserts that the 5 books of Moshe are authentic, immutable, and perfect in original form, yet they believe in oral law gives rabbis the authority to go and add and subtract and build more offenses for our behavior. That's reflected in the Babel Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud that you can buy on Amazon today. It's all written down in that, okay? Now, they believe in a lot of things about Moshiach. They say they believe in Moshiach authorship. They believe in divine revelation. But Orthodoxy holds that God dictated the entire written Torah to Moses, word for word. This includes everything from the 10 Commandments to the genealogical list and mundane narratives, and others, like in the book of Numbers, there's the numbers of different Jewish tribes and things of this nature. That includes all this information. Every letter is considered holy and purposeful. Historical accuracy. Traditional Orthodox views generally accept the events described, such as the Exodus and the flood, and they have dates for that. And these are educated guesses, per se, on extrapolation of information from the 5 books of Torah that means they make sense to them today as far as the dating of how old the earth is, essentially, that kind of thing. Okay? Now, the dual Torah is where orthodoxy pretty much is differentiated from any other form of Judaism. Okay? I've had Orthodox rabbis tell me, you cannot understand the Torah if you don't read the Talmud. They essentially told me. They said most of the Talmud is divine, just like the Torah. That's what they say. Who said that? Well, rabbis said that, okay? And rabbis put themselves as judges over you. There were 70 judges in the time of Jethro. You can read about it in the Torah. And Jethro said it's too much. Well, that's why God appointed 70 judges to help to be the mini Sanhedrin per se, or the Supreme Court there at that time, to arbitrate mundane laws, essentially. Okay? That was a spiritual thing, but rabbis say that gives them the authority because God appointed those judges in the time of Moshe. To just boil it down, the least common denominator. Simultaneous revelation, Orthodox Judaism teaches that Moshe received two components at Sinai: the written Torah, which is known as the Pentateuch, and the oral Torah explanations and legal interpretations. Okay, interdependence. The oral Torah considered essential to understand the written Torah, like I said before. For example, while the written Torah commands you, you shall slaughter, as I have commanded you, it does not tell you what the methods of slaughter entails. In other words, what kind of kosher knife is allowed, not to cause undue pain to the animal that you're killing. Okay, how sharp does it need to be? Okay, again, that according to Qara'ite Judaism, that is called common sense, folks. Do you cut 2 veins or 4 veins in the cow's throat? Okay, Qara'ite Jews have a little bit different view on animal sacrifices. If we did that today, we don't do that anymore, versus Orthodox rabbis. Authenticity of the Talmud. The Mishnah and the Talmud are viewed as the authoritative written preservation of the original oral tradition, carrying virtually the same divine status as the biblical text. Okay, that's how they're really differentiated than any other sect of Judaism, and they own it, they bought it, and that's who they are. Okay, unchanged transmission, preservation. A central tenet is that the Torah has been preserved meticulously without addition or omission. They say this, but at the same time, they admit these moral fences, that they need to build around our behavior to keep us from being seduced to sinfulness, okay? That we don't have any common sense. And so we have to have rabbis essentially as helicopter parents to watch over us to make sure we don't fall into that deadly trap of 7 deadly sins. And this is Maimonides' principle. Now, Maimonides' principles are the 13 fundamental principles of faith. I don't want to get into that. Qara'ite Jews have more or less the same principles. Mostly conservative Judaism abides by this. Not so much Reformed Judaism, because they don't really believe in the resurrection of dead or the new temple and resumption of animal sacrifices. Most of them are vegan for that reason. And they don't believe in the Mashiach. Okay? Also, they reject the so-called documentary hypothesis that's taught in most conservative yeshivas and schools, and is adopted by most conservative rabbis. And I know one in particular I had an argument with about that recently. Internal consistency and summation and conclusion. While some modern Orthodox scholars may engage with these academic challenges to find intellectual reconciliation, the official position remains that the Torah is a unified, divinely authored document. And what this Qara'ite Jew has to say for that is that how can this be true and this be true, Orthodox? How can it be? How can it be the Torah be perfect and true and unified and flawless and immutable, but we need the oral Torah to explain what Moses was trying to explain to Jewish people. And God judged the Jewish people because they deliberately did not obey God's commandments. Not Moses' commandments, but God's commandments espoused to his great prophet, Moshe. So what do you believe in as a Jew? Folks, Reformed Judaism looks and smells a lot like Christianity today. And if you're in Israel, some people say if you're a Reform or conservative Jew, it's pretty much about the same thing. And they got something called Reconstructionism. I didn't get into that. That's essentially, I would say, about the same thing as Reform Judaism, about the same thing, okay? So what do you believe in? It's very interesting. At some point you have faith. There's no room for progressive revelation in my life. I don't think I'm a fool. I think I have common sense. And I do have certain beliefs in my home and certain things I allow in my home, my Jewish home, or certain things I refuse to allow because I have a very impressionable 9-year-old daughter and I have a witness I have to be before my wife and the world. Okay? So God bless you. Shalom Aleichem. I hope everyone has a wonderful day no matter what you're doing. I encourage you to study the inner truths of the Torah and walk away and being blessed. Believe in the Torah and nothing else. There's no other truth that God needs to explain to any rabbi or anyone else or anyone in Berlin or anyone else. It doesn't have to be modernized through our evolved sensibilities and tolerances and tu kulam and 50 different genders and everything else. You know, just rest in the Lord's word and be comforted. This is Hakam Yara ben-Emmett signing out. Let that message of truth go forth to you. All that love, knowledge, and wealth and treasure of truth, may it be unto you as a holy blessing. Shalom Aleichem. If you've enjoyed this program, please click like and subscribe.